So it is true that the built environment might impact behavior differently in different cultural contexts. So it's the forecasting model when we test how the state of place index impacts whatever the outcome it is we're measuring. That's where you start to pick up the nuance that culture, ethnicity, nationality might actually influence that relationship. And that's why a lot of our recommendations are based off of something that's more calibrated to the area itself. But we try not to touch the state of place index because we want that to be a benchmark that everybody can look to.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community podcast, I have a very interesting conversation with Dr. Mariela Alfonzo. Mariela is the founder and CEO of State of Place, an AI-driven urban design data and predictive analytics software that helps city makers create more thriving communities. In this episode, Mariela begins by telling us about her background in urban planning, her focus on how built environment shapes our perception, and what a smart community means to her. Mariela then tells us how she began her startup, State of Place, and a bit about what they do and the range of clients Mariela works with. Mariela then shares with us a use case where her work has made real impact, and she explains how the built environment is actually formed in the world from a cultural context. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trends of addressing the issue of equity and how our environments can predetermine how well we live. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Mariela. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. Just wrapped up dinner.
Excellent. Well, I'm just starting. Well, it's 10:30 a.m. here, so been up for a few hours now. Really keen to have this conversation. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you are passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I'm Mariela Alfonzo. I'm the founder and CEO of State of Place. I am also an assistant research professor at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. So by way of background, I have a PhD in urban planning. I studied at University of California, Irvine. And my focus there was really around the relationship between urban design and behavior. And for the last couple of decades or so now, every time I say that, gosh, I feel so incredibly old. But for about 20 years, my focus has been on quantifying how the built environment shapes our choices, our perceptions, our feelings, our attitudes, and then how in turn that impacts different aspects of value. So not just economic value, but also health value, environmental value, and social value. And the goal has been to really use this much more data-driven and evidence-based approach to advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable places, kind of targeting two key challenges that cities in particular tend to have in actually creating these kinds of places. One is there's limited resources, whether that's time, budget, capacity. So how do you actually ensure that the decisions you're making about what to invest in from a built environment perspective are the things that are the most effective and cost efficient, and most importantly, are the things that actually are much more likely to lead to improvements in quality of life in an inclusive and equitable way. But also, too, how do you make those decisions in a way that builds trust and kind of gets the consensus that you really need to ensure that those decisions see the light of day? So really kind of fostering community engagement and co-creation of those solutions. And when you have a more data-driven and evidence-based approach, that's a lot easier than decisions that have been made sort of inside the building in a top-down way. So that's kind of been my approach, which basically my startup, State of Place, which is a software, has allowed many, many more cities than I could have ever done, individually to take on that data and evidence.
Yeah, That's really awesome. I'm really keen to dive into more about your company and what you're doing. And yeah, linking those two things together is, I think, a really key component of that as well. And thinking about that data-driven decision-making, but also that it's humans is what we're thinking about, and creating great places. There's key ingredients, but we know that there's many different places that are great for different reasons and that type of thing. But let's go first broad. So what is a smart community to you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I got a little bit at that in kind of the explanation of what I do and why I do it. But to me, a smart community is one that is healthy, it's livable, it's sustainable, it's equitable. And you notice that I didn't really talk about technology there. I'm not a technologist. To me, I came at tech primarily as a means to an end. As I said before, the work that I had been doing was primarily from a consulting standpoint. So for me, technology was a way to reach more people, to be more effective in, I can't do all the research. I can't provide the knowledge to everybody. So to me, when I define a smart community, it's more about the outcomes that it should deliver, healthy, livable, sustainable, equitable, with technology being something that enables those outcomes in more effective and cost-efficient ways.
So thinking about it, as you were talking there, you had this, you're doing consulting, you knew that you can't possibly reach every single city, but you know that there's these common themes across that you could spread, which would then enable more livable, sustainable, and equitable communities. So thinking about technology as that tool to be able to scale that in a way that's really effective. I think that's really important, because I think sometimes, we do get caught up in thinking about, well, what technology can I put into this? But actually those concepts that you had, they're really, really important, and what people actually care about. And they're the things that are making the difference. The technology is just then enabling you to be able to do that on a much broader scale.
Exactly.
And how did you, I guess, like when you're working in this space, at what point did you go, okay, this is great, this is all working, I want to increase this impact? What kind of process did you go through? Because, starting a tech startup of all things, is, I imagine, quite an interesting process, and one to not be taken on lightly.
Yeah, absolutely not. But maybe the naivete on my part allowed that path to happen. Yeah, so I was working as a consultant. I started consulting actually while I was still in grad school pursuing my PhD. And I actually was working, my very first consulting project, which was in Houston, lent the name to my company, eventually State of Place. It was a project in which I was tasked essentially to, on the fly, convert a very academic product, something called the Irvine, Minnesota Inventory, which I had helped develop as a grad student, which measured different aspects of the built environment. It was meant mainly as a research tool. So researchers, academics could test hypotheses about how the built environment impacted walkability and health outcomes in particular. But I met these kind of random guys in Houston that wanted to rank different places. And I was like, oh, well, how are you going to do that? They're like, well, we're just going to ask some folks, what their opinions are. I'm like, I'm not sure about that. There might be some data that we can bring to this equation. So on the fly, I came up with this methodology that eventually became the algorithm for State of Place, which is this way that we aggregate now 125 different aspects of the built environment into a score that measures walkability and bikeability and livability. But anyway, so I had come up with this very, very early version of that score, and, I finished my PhD work. I moved to Washington, D.C. and started to work with Chris Lineberger. He's very well known in the real estate space. So at that point, I had essentially the makings of a diagnostic tool that we could use to measure communities' assets and needs from a built environment perspective. But as I started to talk more and more to the folks that had decision-making authority and power, just quantifying the quality of the built environment and drawing attention to its social value, which is what I had been working on at the time, wasn't enough. So they really wanted an economic rationale as to why you should invest in more walkable places in particular. And this was, I started this work in 2007. So we were kind of in a different landscape then, where this economic rationale was much more needed. Long story shorter, because it's definitely not short, we published a report via the Brookings Institution called Walk This Way, which quantified that algorithm, so the state of place index, with a variety of real estate outcomes, things like retail revenues and retail rents, office rents, et cetera. And it was from there, that was published in 2012, that I had the idea for state of place, because I felt that the fact that we had a tool that could diagnostically explain from an objective and quantifiable standpoint what was missing and what could be improved from the built environment standpoint, and a way to then say, oh, if you make these changes, here are the benefits that will accrue. Here's the reason why you should do this. I thought that had some sort of basis for a product. And I was always looking for something that was productizable, because I never really wanted to grow a large consulting company. So from then, I left Virginia Tech. I started at NYU, which is where I'm at now, and got very involved with the entrepreneurship community and realized just how little I knew. I knew already that I knew very little, but it was particularly humbling, like talking to folks from the business school, and I just started to kind of learn about what was really the core of the problem that this data, this evidence could address. So that was the first piece of the puzzle, is let's really understand cities, their challenges, why are they having a hard time making these justifications to begin with? And it was really there that I started to identify those two things that I mentioned at the beginning. It's limited resources and a lot of decisions being made inside the building, expert-led, which meant mostly older, white male dominated, which, by de facto is not generally representative. And then you'd come with that decision and say, hey, go to a public hearing. And then they're like, why don't you like this idea? It's a brilliant idea, right? And so it lacked, any sort of engagement with the community, but also didn't take an advantage of decades of research on the built environment and outcomes. So once I had kind of identified what those problems were, I started to talk to VCs. They had nothing to do with me for a variety of reasons. I think I was very early, female founder, non-tech, Hispanic, like all of the bad things. And this was a while ago too. So, fast forward a little bit, I ended up getting a grant from the National Science Foundation. In the US, they have something called the Small Business Innovation Research Program that offers grants to high risk, what they consider high risk companies, which I definitely would have qualified as, so they're providing the R&D funding in particular that is needed to kind of take to the next step. And that's really what allowed, State of Place to become a software. I should probably talk to you more about what State of Place is at some point, but that's kind of the arc that we've taken to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that. I think it's really important because, as much as we're talking about smart communities, all of our journeys are really relevant to the work that we do and where we end up. And also the fact that tech and data that enables us to do these things, so then we can have a greater impact and things. So I think it's really important. And then also people listening, we have a range of listeners, we have CEOs, we have, government agencies, but we also have a lot of students and like younger people that are maybe thinking about getting into this space and how they can do that. So thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you a few questions about the indicators within the built environment and that type of thing. But let's talk about State of Place first, because maybe we can then lead that conversation into there. So tell us what State of Place is, what it does, and some of your favorite projects.
Yeah. And that will answer your question about the built environment piece. So we'll kind of, kill two birds at once. But in any case, what State of Place is, it's a predictive analytics software. We collect data, as I mentioned earlier, on 125 different aspects of what we call the microscale built environment. at the street level. So these are things like whether there's sidewalks, crosswalk markings, curb cuts, the width of the roads, all sorts of different land uses, whether there's on-street parking, outdoor dining. But again, everything that really influences how we feel in a place, which then translates back to these different quality of life factors. So we do this in the last 2 years. We've developed visual machine learning models so that we can collect this data automatically from street level images, which then allows us to actually offer this data at a very large geography, citywide, region-wide. When we first started State of Place, we were doing this with trained human raters. So we were only kind of offering this at maybe a few neighborhoods at a time. So that's kind of the first step in the process. We collect this data, then we aggregate it using the algorithm that I mentioned that produces the State of Place Index, which effectively crunches all of that data into a really easy to understand score from 0 to 100 that measures walkability, livability, and bikeability. And so that score is broken down into 10 different areas of urban design quality. So you can kind of really understand why you got the score that you got. So these are things like pedestrian and bike amenities and traffic safety, connectivity, urban form, recreational facilities, and the like. And that's really the diagnostic aspect of the tool. The software visualizes that data in heat maps, and that really helps you identify areas of what we call spatial inequities. So like maybe historic divestments in the built environment. And in the case of the US, that happens to often be tied to, historically racist policies. So being able to kind of objectively identify those places that maybe need to be prioritized from an investment standpoint. And then we also visualize the data graphically, like in a bar chart. So you can kind of easily see, this area really needs attention, from a parks and public spaces perspective, as opposed to connectivity or whatever. And then we have a variety of forecasting models. So I mentioned at the beginning, my work has been around quantifying the value of urban design. So with State of Place, we've been able to show how changes in the State of Place index are statistically related to those real estate factors that I mentioned before, but also more recently, we've expanded that to predict COVID rates, different rates of chronic disease, flood and heat rates, crime, and then vehicle miles traveled, so how much people drive, and then also the likelihood of vehicle collision. So kind of hitting all of these different aspects of value and quality of place or life rather. And so what we do with that information, because that sounds very academic, we put that into the tool so that communities can say, what goals do you want to achieve? We're not asking communities to say, I want a sidewalk or I want a park. They can certainly have opinions about that, but we find that what really matters to them more is how this is going to impact their life. So by virtue of being able to prioritize the goals, we can then identify the urban design changes from an evidence standpoint that are most likely to let them achieve those goals. So it's kind of a recommendation engine. And then we have, my favorite part of the tool is like our SimCity-like scenario tool, where you can actually start to test if you add trees or benches or sidewalks, what is that going to do to your State of Place index? And then the forecasting aspect of the tool then says, okay, if you increase your index by 20 points, you might see a reduction in asthma rates of X%, or an increase in retail revenues of X, or a reduction in how much people drive of X, right? So we're able to quantify how those community scale infrastructure investments ultimately translate into the things that resonate to people's lives. And so that really helps to communicate the value of why cities are investing the way that they are, but also identify what are the best, return on investments, and most effective use of funds.
Yeah, wow, no, it sounds super interesting. And just taking on that last point of just say we have $100,000, then we can shift things around to see, actually, we do this and this in this round, that will increase by whatever, and then reduce and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So I think that's a really useful thing as well, because as much as we want to be able to do everything and make everything amazing, we have time limits, resources, efforts, and budgets for councils. But yeah, this gives them a bit of an evidence base to be able to do that and then communicate to the community, I assume, as well, like looking at how they can, one, in the first instance, your kind of SimCity analogy of putting things here or there, getting the community potentially to, then they can see, oh, well, that's what that would look like. But then also communicating that if we do this, this is the likely outcome. I think community is, that feedback loop is so important. I think we forget how important that is a lot of the time. It's like, because if people provide feedback and they don't think it's taken on board, even if it is or you know, was changed in a certain way, if that loop doesn't happen, that language, like, you know, we're not speaking their language back to them again, that's when we get disengaged communities and they feel disempowered because they don't think they're being listened to. So I think that's really important too.
Yep.
Who do you normally, like, who are your clients, who are you working with at the moment? Are they like municipalities or state governments or a range of different people?
Yeah, we have worked at essentially all levels of the government, certainly local municipalities. We've worked with regional agencies, like county governments here in the States. We've also worked with regional association of multiple different kinds of cities across states, and then with the states themselves. So it's really kind of, it's more about what is their purview, really. Like, we work with people within government that their decisions have some sort of impact on the physical manifestation of place. It's the way we kind of try to narrow it down, because every city and every government is structured very differently. But mostly we've worked with planning departments, transportation, also, of course, with the Smart City and Innovation Office. They tend to be really great champions of the tool. We've worked with, even like within kind of the public health and public works, community and economic development. We've also actually worked with the private sector as well. Some real estate developers that are social impact focused in particular, as well as real estate investors that also tend to have a social impact investment. And we've worked both in the US, Europe, and China as well.
Yeah, awesome. Can you give us like an example or a case study of where you've seen real kind of impact or change happen?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, like one of my favorite projects. So the work that we did with the city of Philadelphia, which I'm actually going to the Smart Cities Connect conference next week, my second in-person event. But so we worked with the city of Philadelphia and we got a Smart 50 award for this work. But what we did for them, we started talking to them early in the pandemic, right after the uprisings from Black Lives Matter, after the murder of George Floyd here in the States. And it was very clear to them that many of the outcomes that they were seeing, or the disparate outcomes, I should say, that they were seeing from COVID in terms of who was getting it, who was being hospitalized, who was dying from it. These were the same communities that were suffering from other disparate outcomes, flood, heat, crime rates. And we felt like there was a common tie to the built environment divestments that had been the case for centuries, really. And so what we worked with them to do, this was a bit more of a custom work that was part of a pilot project that we did for them. But this allowed us to expand our forecasting models to show how the state of place index impacted all of those things that I mentioned. So COVID, pretty much every single comorbidity that was tied to COVID, asthma, lung disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. But then these other things, the environmental pieces of flood and heat and the more social aspects of public safety. So being able to quantify all this and then identify spatially where these divestments were happening and that these were the same places where these impacts were being felt the most allowed them to weave together this very quantitative data story, if you will, about how these disinvestments were impacting communities at all different aspects of their lives, which then really helped them do a couple of things. One, much more easily justify the heavy investment in these areas, But also, we've had conversations with the city since the pilot to expand it across almost every single department you could think of. Their sustainability department, water, their violence prevention, public works, participatory budgeting, regular budgeting, the mayor's office, and what's been really interesting, especially for their smart cities director, you may have interviewed her before, Emily Yates.
Yep.
But she was, she's very much a systems thinker. And this allowed her to say, see, like the built environment matters across all these different departments. If we had this tool and subscribe to it, citywide, not only would this would lead to more effective decisions, it would allow for a much more transdisciplinary collaboration across departments where it tends to be siloed because they're all kind of touching the same thing. And if they came together, in this more collaborative approach, that could really not just impact, people's lives more, which is of course the main goal, but also just make their city governments so much more efficient and people can talk to each other on the same platform, right? So to me, that was one of the most interesting use cases, but there has been, others where it's been used to convince other folks in their department. Like they started off with one plan that scored kind of like on the State of Place Index, and then they were able to use recommendations from our tool and increase their score by significantly, and then say to other departments, yeah, this is why we need to do this pedestrian and bike plan in this way versus the other way. So a lot of even internal advocating in addition to public advocating as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And yes, we've had Emily on the podcast and we love the work that she and her team are doing. And we've had a few other people around who have also super fans. We had Chelsea Collier and Jennifer Sanders recently. So yeah, we've had the whole crew, which is amazing. And I love talking to all of them because they bring such different perspectives into this space. And I think that, more of this, regional collaboration and then thinking about how we use data to make those better decisions is really important. But they're bringing people together, like exactly what you were saying. It's not just about the data. It's how can we have conversations now? We're speaking the same language because we're looking at the same data. When it's not hearsay or this is more important than that. We can really bring that together. So no, that's really important. And thanks for sharing because we love examples. We love case studies. We're going to zoom to the future shortly, but you say you're working, Europe, China, and the US. I'm keen to understand, like, obviously the context is quite different in each of those places. I mean, each city will be different as well. How does the tool or how does the thinking actually allow for that different kind of context in a cultural sense, but also, how the built form is actually, formed in the world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it really comes down to the fact that the State of Place Index, the underlying data that we're collecting is really an inventory of what's there and what's not. Like, is there a bench? How wide is the sidewalk? Is it in good repair? And that answer is going to be the same no matter where you are, right? There's a few little features here and there that you might find in China that you don't find in Europe or the US or vice versa. And we've been able to adjust for that and kind of broaden out the tool. So the built environment, the inventory itself, the data that underlies it stays the same. So we've been able to adjust for context in a couple of ways. And you're spot on that this happens even internally within the US as well. So the way that we collect our data, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little bit geeky here, but we have these, if you think about how you collect data, if you think about a sidewalk, right? You say, is there a sidewalk? No, it gets a score of 0, right? If there's a sidewalk on one side of the street, it gets a score of 1. If it gets a sidewalk on both sides, it gets 2. But then you might have a different feature that's not measured in that way. Maybe it's measured, there's 10 lanes, right? So then you have 0 to 10. So what we do with each feature is to transform it into something called the Z-score. So because you want to be able to add all of these features together, but if you have different scales for each feature, you don't want one to necessarily count more than the other, right? So everything gets transformed into the Z-score, which basically tells you how far away from the average score are you, right? So that's always going to be very relative. The Z-score that you get is based off of the average. It's based off of the continuum, sort of the range of scores that you see in a particular place. So our overall database will give you a score relative to what's the highest that we have in our database and what's the lowest that we have in our database. So that's how we create the state of place index. But sometimes you end up in a place like some of our customers, their cities are very car oriented and they tend to not get as great of a score because what we're measuring is things like walkability and bikeability, right? So that means that they're kind of crunched. All of their streets are like from 30 to 40, because what we do is we get that Z-score and we normalize it, meaning that the Z-score, because you're talking about if it's over or under the average, you get a negative or a positive score. Nobody likes to get negative scores. So you transform that into a score from 0 to 100, and that's called normalization. So when you normalize it, you basically say, okay, what's the highest and what's the lowest? And that's how you get 0 to 100. But if we also do sometimes for communities to say, well, let's normalize it based on your database. Let's normalize it based on what your highest score is versus what your lowest score is. And then that gives you a little bit more gradation, if you will, more nuance in the score that's relative to that area. So that's one way we've approached it so that you kind of get both. You get the full benchmark. How are you actually measuring up to this more national, international data set? You want people to be aspirational. You want to give them the true score, but you also kind of want to give them how they measure up within their community. So that's one way we address it. The other way is with the forecasting models themselves. So it is true that the built environment might impact behavior differently in different cultural contexts. So it's the forecasting model when we test how the state of place index impacts whatever the outcome it is we're measuring. That's where you start to pick up the nuance that culture, ethnicity, nationality might actually influence that relationship. And that's why a lot of our recommendations are based off of something that's more calibrated to the area itself. But we try not to touch the state of place index because we want that to be a benchmark that everybody can look to.
And I think like with the normalization, and I love statistics, so Z scores are all I love a good Z score, but true, no one wants a negative score. But the normalization, I think, would given the aspirational score, or, the national, international score, like you said, but if you give them that contextual one as well, then they can prioritize their investment, right? So we're going to go this one, there might be a score of, I don't know, I'm just making numbers up, but just say it's 20 and 21. You might not think that that's super different, but actually when you spread it out, it's like then you'll get this more granular. So then you'll go, oh, actually we want to invest in this road first, then this one, this one, based on the score or whatever the case is. So yeah, no, cool. No, thanks for sharing that. I love getting a bit nerdy, so I appreciate that as well. We're ready to zoom to the future now. Let's talk about the trends, the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough.
Yeah, I looked at this question. I was like, how am I going to answer this question as a techie, right? Because for me, I'm a city lover. I love walkable places. I'm definitely a data geek, given what I just talked about. But that's not always the same from a technological perspective. I think the thing for me really comes down to, are you addressing this issue of equity? I think that COVID and many other factors have laid bare how much where we live and the quality of the environment of where we live can really, in some ways, predetermine how well we live. And so to me, that is the question of our time. And if you're not tackling that, then you're not emerging for me, right? Like those are the kinds of trends that, I would like to see perhaps emerge more and not just play lip service to it, right? Like really getting into the nuts and bolts of that, being uncomfortable with everything that comes along with having those conversations, understanding how to not center everything about white comfort and white spaces. And that technology and data can very much help us have those conversations in a way that's very productive, but maybe allows us to be vulnerable. So I don't know if this is the exact answer that you were looking for, because I mean, obviously this is a thing that's very close to state of place, and this is a big part of our mission and what we're trying to do. with our tools. So I guess you could call us emerging, even though we have a long history. But that's what I would love to see really is more tools tackling this straight on, but in a way that's not just, oh, now we're going to add equity to the end of a long, list of things that we were already doing, right? So I think that that's really important. I think that the other aspect of tools that are emerging that speak to the moment are what we were talking about earlier, that, those that are thinking about how can we create a tool that breaks those silos, that pulls people together, that helps them understand how their decisions are interconnected. And then the last thing that I would say is in this regard, I'm really excited by the folks in the health equity tech space, because they're very much what I just said about the equity, they're right there, but they're looking at it very much either individual health perspective or a public health perspective. I think there's a huge opportunity for these communities to come together, the smart community, the health tech community, because so much of these are intertwined, and I don't see as many people focusing on the built environment piece within that health equity community. And the folks within smart cities looking at health, they tend to be very like, okay, I'm going to have a sensor that measures air quality, which of course is important, but it's kind of one little piece. It's missing that systems approach, right? So I guess what I'm telling you more is what I hope will emerge rather than exactly what's emerging. But yeah.
No, the way things emerge is we start talking about them, right? And, there's stuff moving in that direction. And I think if we bring to people's awareness these things, and then we start talking about them more and more, and they become more topics of conversation. But I also think it's not just about technology, like you said, but these trends, and trend is the word I use, but it's definitely about different philosophies that are coming through, different things we should be focusing on. And I think you're exactly right. Bringing those things together so we can have better conversations, and not just conversations, but action, those as well at a real tangible level is key. And I think evidence to do that and have those conversations that may, yes, be uncomfortable at times, but the only way we're going to move forward is if we have them now and do something differently in the future, because the status quo, we know, doesn't serve a lot of people very well at all. And so how do we use the things that we have at our fingertips, but also things just beyond, or the things that are in people's minds that we haven't quite unlocked yet, to actually make these future communities better than the ones that we have now for everyone.
Yeah, preach.
There's my TED Talk. Well, it's been so great to have you on the podcast, Mariela. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and we definitely should have another one. And I'm hoping I've got to get over to the US at some point and see all my smart community friends over there. So I'll let you know, because we should definitely catch up at 3D. I just put it out in the world, right? And somehow it'll happen. But yeah, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. How can people connect with you?
A couple of ways. I'm very online. So my Twitter handle, I'm very active on there. It's City Food Lover, all one word. I also have a separate Twitter handle for State of Place, which is State of Place. You can reach me in my email, which is Mariela@stateofplace. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm all over.
Excellent. We'll put all the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you, as well as your website. People are curious to check out what's happening there as well. And good luck at the conference. I think you're speaking at the conference on a panel. Is that right?
I am, bright and early in the morning.
Amazing.
It's on infrastructure and equity.
Awesome. That sounds like an amazing panel. And yeah, I'm a bit jealous. I really want to be there in 3D. But anyway, one day soon. Next time. Anyway, this isn't about me. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, and I truly look forward to our next conversation. So thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Are you looking for an engaging speaker, MC, or facilitator for your next big event? Then we've got you covered. Zoe is a go-to speaker, MC, and conversation facilitator with a difference. She's a master at simplifying the complex and making connections you might never see. Book Zoe for your next event. Email hello@mysmart.community or head over to her speaker page, www.mysmart.community/speaking.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.